that approach by Kim Il-sung and then Kim Jong-il, that, you just can't deviate from something once you've said it, is what we see with Donald Trump. He doesn't want to shift from tariffs, and I don't know what can shift him from that policy. In Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il's case, empty shelves was not enough to shift them on policy. A famine was not enough to shift them on policy.
This is the Rhyming Chaos podcast, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval or authoritarian takeover. I hope these interviews can help us understand what is happening in the United States right now and how decent people can fight against it. I'm your host, Jeremy Goldkorn. I grew up in apartheid South Africa, down the road from Elon Musk. I lived in China for 20 years, and I've been living in Nashville, Tennessee since 2015. Today, I am delighted to welcome Paul French to the show. Paul is the best-selling author of the historical murder mystery, Midnight in Peking, and many other works of history. Today, I want to talk to him about North Korea, or the DPRK, the Democratic Republic of Korea, as they call themselves. Paul wrote North Korea, State of Paranoia, a book last updated in 2015. He's also written a Kindle special called Our Supreme Leader, The Making of Kim Jong-un, and he's the presenter of the BBC radio drama documentary, The Defectors, which came out this year, I believe. Paul also produced Death at the Airport, the plot against Kim Jong-nam for BBC Radio. So Kim Jong-nam obviously was Kim Jong-un's half-brother. The show isn't currently available, but if you email Paul, he'll send you a copy. His email is pfrench@gmail.com. Welcome to Rhyming Chaos, Paul, and thank you for giving me for kind of stealing the name from your excellent China rhyming newsletter.
Well, I'm a rhyming kind of person. I always get a metaphor and analogy confused. So I kind of went for rhyming, obviously Mark Twain. And historical recurrence is kind of what we think about more. Otherwise, it gets a bit confusing.
Yes, yeah, that makes sense. So, let's leap straight into it. How would you compare what I'm mostly calling the Musk-Trump regime running the United States right now with North Korea and the leadership styles of Trump and Kim?
Well, I think, look, there's a lot of stuff being thrown around at the moment, which is all fascinating. The main one being that this is somehow like China's Cultural Revolution, which is obviously one that people like you and me are going to think about a lot and come to some sort of conclusion on. And it seems to me, of course, there are always some historical recurrences, but there doesn't seem to me to be a lot in the Cultural Revolution to get a hold of in terms of understanding Trump. So it isn't someone who's been in power for a very long time. This isn't the idea of rejuvenating in some way. It is, but not in the sense that was done. We're not seeing, the levels of violence and so on that we saw in the Cultural Revolution. And it seems to me to blithely throw in the Cultural Revolution is to sort of rather diminish that horrendous 10-year experience for the Chinese people. And I know that some people say, but someone in China told me it's just like that. Well, sorry, but, just because you live somewhere doesn't mean you get to be the arbiter of that place's history. I could tell you that there's a historical recurrence, if you like, in Trump and Musk in terms of Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell, right?
Right.
Someone who doesn't like the system is trying to change it so that it suits them. And out goes the Catholic Church and all of their lands, and those people get punished. And the Church of England is created, and you have someone who goes around and steals everything from the monasteries and so on, who is your kind of, Tudor Beethan Trump, Musk. Sorry. Just because I'm English doesn't make that right when I use an analogy about Henry VIII. Now, the more I think about it, the more I quite like it, but I'm not going to stick with it. And we've seen others. We've seen it's Pol Pot in year zero in Cambodia. Obviously, the Nazis in 1933, Italians in 1921, 1922. And I saw one in the South China Morning Post that you can try and get your head around, which is the last years of the Qing dynasty and the Empress Dowager Cixi after she declared war on everyone in 1900. What you do is you kind of create a reaction during the Boxer Uprising in the last years of the Qing, which means that you get the 8-power allied army and people who weren't necessarily all that friendly with each other join together in order to invade and loot Peking. But that idea that if you impose one idea, you end up finding that all your enemies make common cause against you may well be of some interest to us if we just think of this as historical recurrence. And that all of these have something to offer. None of them are an absolute template.
Right. I think that's clear. I think there are some careless references to the Cultural Revolution. And perhaps worst of all is I think there are a lot of people, particularly in this country, in America, who are a little confused about what exactly the Cultural Revolution was. So it's not necessarily a clear analogy, even though I do think there's a lot about a self-coup of the act of hollowing out your own government from within when you're already in power that is worth discussing.
Well, I have to tell you, Jeremy, sitting here in the Islamic Republic of Great Britain in London with no freedom of speech whatsoever, apparently, so J.D. Vance tells me, I rather wonder if he's going to be able to get his head round Pol Pot or the Empress Dowager Cixi, let alone North Korea or the Cultural Revolution.
So, I mean, do you think that there is something, though, that we can say about Kim Jong-un and Trump that is similar, or is that just a rhyme too far?
No, I don't think so. In fact, to me, it's a better rhyme than the Chinese Cultural Revolution or Pol Pot or the Empress Dowager. To me, I see a lot in the theatrical victimhood that Trump and the MAGA movement kind of uses, that everyone is against us, everyone is trying to take advantage of us, and this never goes away. We can declare victory at certain points, but there'll always be something more that we have to do. So the war, sort of real or economic, has to go on and on and on. And I think that notion of theatrical victimhood, that everyone is against us, that the Europeans have been taking advantage for so long, that China has taken advantage for so long, in the way that Kim Il-sung very effectively, and through Kim Jong-il and through Kim Jong-un now, has used this notion of theatrical victimhood very, very well. And I think that's kind of good. And that seems to me something that's useful. I mean, obviously, I noticed from the timer, we're not yet 10 minutes in. And obviously, as an Englishman, I'm going to have to bring George Orwell into the conversation almost immediately.
Are we going to do that now? Are we going to go full Orwell?
I think he keeps popping up. But I think that this idea of theatrical victimhood and war, economic war in this case, but, who knows, right? With Greenland and Canada and so on, and Panama. This idea of war as a sort of perpetual thing that goes on.
Right.
In order to keep power, in order to keep stirring your base, in order to keep people, the old magician trick of look over here while I do something over here kind of thing. So that Orwell's idea in 1984, of course, of perpetual war, perpetual victimhood, I think is kind of relevant in this idea, even down to the fact that, what is Trump planning for his birthday, right? A multi-million-dollar military parade.
Yeah.
Through Washington. Now, of course, other countries have military parades. I mean, here in Britain, we don't really do military parades, but the French, just over the water, they do military parades, right? They're quite fun sort of occasions when everyone marches down the Champs-Élysées.
Oh, I believe Trump was inspired by the French military parade to want his own one in the last presidency, and he's going to get it this time.
Absolutely. But, the French one is quite a sort of an interesting one as to why they do it. They've always done it. It's linked to the liberation and things, obviously, but this is something that we also associate with Russia and particularly the Soviet Union and now with Putin and, of course, with North Korea. I mean, North Korea has always done big, spectacular military parades with everyone going past. So I don't think he's not aware of that. He will have seen those military parades in North Korea and he's just thought, like, that's got to be on my Christmas list. I really want one.
I wonder if he's going to start planning a mass games like the Arirang, where that would be rather wonderful.
Well, he's got the Olympics coming up.
Ah, that's right. That's right. Although I don't know if they could actually train enough Americans to hold up those placards to make those kind of mosaic art things.
Well, I'm looking forward to the North Koreans when they get into the meme business, like the Chinese have done, showing Americans in factories, of showing sort of, your average red state American doing mass gymnastics.
Yes. So in December last year, Trump told a Fox News interviewer, he said, "We helped South Korea come back from the Korean War. It's time we stop. They are money machine. It's time we stop. On trade, it's an enemy." What do you make of this? Is this just more of the victimhood narrative that we've been talking about?
Yeah, I think it's everyone against us. Everyone is taking us for what we're worth. We're the richest nation on earth and everyone wants to take from us. And he doesn't have a sense of American responsibility or sort of generosity in a sort of Kennedy-esque sort of sense. And of course, the American policy to South and North Korea has been erratic, to say the least, looking at it from outside. Going back, you don't need to go all the way back to the war, but let's just go back to Clinton, which was the engagement policy. And that was a kind of fascinating time when there was an attempt by America to understand what was happening in North Korea and to try and get their heads around it. But then we went into Bush 2. And it was the axis of evil with, Iran, Iraq, North Korea. The Obama years were ones of what they called strategic patience, which was a kind of a do-nothing sort of policy. Obama, as you know, wasn't really that interested in many of those overseas issues. And then, of course, we got to Trump 1. So, of course, Trump has form on North Korea because that was when he was going to show everyone the art of the deal as applied to international diplomacy, right? And off they all trotted to Sentosa in Singapore. And there was the handshake, and it was a really, I think, big win for Kim Jong-un at that time.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it all fell apart, as his deals tend to, in Saigon a little bit later. So, now we were back with Biden and sanctions, which was kind of an interesting period because China got slightly involved in that as well. Then, of course, Ukraine has seen a lot of changes with North Korea and the Russian alliance. But now, stony silence so far. One of those, he doesn't seem to have anything much to say about the North at the moment. But to get back to your point, what he has done is, obviously rattled the South Koreans. There's a troop commitment by America to South Korea. And, in the idea that, of course, all of us in Europe now have that America is an unreliable partner, the South Korea must be thinking that as well. And I think that the interesting thing on that is, to come back, everything, as Engels teaches us, everything comes back to economics. And the recent sort of...
Look at you sneaking in a bit of Marxism into the show, huh?
Well, you got to. The idea that you can kind of have an economic policy that brings together Japan, South Korea, and China. After all we've been through with, from the 1950s through to SCAD and, all of that is kind of incredible, really.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary.
So, of course, they're looking at him and thinking, well, what do we do? And it's a more dramatic version of us here in Britain looking at him and thinking, maybe we have to make nice with the Europeans again, right? So it's like he's kind of forcing alliances to be made. And I think perhaps this is where it is interesting to think of the end of the Qing and Xi, that you force people to come together in this way, which of course North Korea sort of did in the 1950s through remember that war was not America's war, it was a United Nations action. So that kind of brought people together in a way to sort of, resist something that a large number of nations didn't want at that time, but that of course ended up in the actual creation of the DPRK.
Right. So, what's your sense of the relationship now between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, if there is one at all? In 2018, he said that Kim had written him beautiful letters and we fell in love. And then there were the meetings and then it fell apart, as you've just described. How do you think their relationship is these days? Or what do you think the dynamic is if there isn't really an actual communication?
One of the most fascinating things is from the outside is to watch Trump get played and not realize it's happened. It's kind of, that's kind of fascinating. So, what can he possibly do now? The North Koreans are obviously put their lot in with the Russians on Ukraine. The Chinese are backing away from that one pretty quickly at the moment. I have to tell you, Jeremy, I was in Beijing a fortnight or so ago. I was quite stunned at how many people, that I sort of walked into meetings with. And admittedly, this is sort of people in the sort of middle class intellectual industries of publishing and so on, but who were openly wearing kind of, pro-Ukraine T-shirts and pro-Ukraine pin badges. And the number of people who've kind of got Kiev as their location on their WeChat and things like that.
That is amazing.
And was sort of saying, and I was sort of like, in my sort of, wow, I wasn't expecting that. Sort of like, do you get any trouble for that? And they were just sort of like, only now and again. Obviously, being pro-Ukrainian in Beijing means a whole heap more in terms of what you're saying than it does in London or Paris or anywhere else. So you're saying something about your own government as well. And I thought that was kind of fascinating. Trump doesn't see, here we are at day 100. So he's 99 days over his estimation of when he could finish the war in Ukraine. And now he's kind of a little bit angry with Putin, but not that angry at Putin. He's got people around him who are very pro-Putin. He's got people around him who are more leaning towards Ukraine. It's a real mess for that. He's forced the Europeans to sort of come together much more and to envisage NATO without the United States and to start making the funding commitments that requires. So again, he's managed to create another world through the decisions that he's sort of made. And I think that's a kind of an interesting one for the North Koreans as well, because, they kind of have also made decisions that have forced the South to make decisions that they might not have made, largely through their nuclear weapons policy, the North's nuclear weapons policy.
Yeah. There was some reporting on Monday or Sunday, I think Axios did it, that they reported that the Trump administration has been quietly holding discussions and consulting outside experts as it considers options for potentially restarting the dialogue with North Korea. So it's so strange that this government of Trump seems to want to antagonize all its closest friends and cozy up to people who, by their own account, are the enemies of the United States.
It's very confusing. Sort of strikes me when we talk about, the rhyming that's happening here is that one of the things that North Korea, from Kim Il-sung almost through to now Kim Jong-un, is that there has always been, economically speaking anyway, one big idea, right? And for the North Koreans, that's always been Stalinism. And by Stalinism, I mean, the conception of the party state, the conception of the nation, the conception of socialism in one country, and again, permanent war, always the threat of escalation of that from a Cold War to a hot war. And the other thing from Stalin that runs through all three generations of the Kim leadership is purging, right? I mean, that's another thing that Donald Trump looks at very closely, I think, purging. I mean, different sort of purging to North Korea, but, we've seen various Republicans who've kind of stepped out of line be absolutely purged instantly, right, and away from things.
I mean, I think it is getting more similar. I mean, they're not like men in the middle of the night taking away former government officials that Trump is displeased with, but they are doing that to students.
Yeah, but, like the idea that if you go against the leadership, even in a supposed multi-party democracy, because look at the Democratic Party at the moment, if you go against Trump, you will be politically destroyed.
Yeah.
You will lose your livelihood. You will not be re-elected. Large amounts of effort will be made. You will be absolutely destroyed online. All sorts of things will happen to you. Trump, of course, has this one big idea that he's been holding for decades now of tariffs.
Yeah.
An idea that's sort of been reinforced by his only real advisor on China, who's this
crazy Peter
Navarro, right? And the idea that China is this outside existential threat, whereas Kim Il-sung, of course, always had the United States. Navarro's kind of amazing. I mean, the least qualified sinologist I've ever sort of come across, in terms of in-country experience, language, education, I mean, everything, right? I mean,
he just doesn't know a lot about China.
Yeah, I don't know where the hell this guy came from or what the hell happened there. But Trump has this idea of tariffs and he won't shift from it, right? Kim Il-sung had this idea of the Stalinist planned economy and all the stuff that wraps around it to create socialism in one country. And he refused to move away from it. Even now, Kim Jong-un is finding it very hard to move away from basic elements of that, 5-year plans, collectivized agriculture and so on. But even when the idea becomes kind of redundant, because these things can sometimes work for a while. For a few years, the DPRK actually outstripped South Korea in terms of growth after the end of the Korean War. But then central planning became as redundant as really tariffs are today. I mean, this is an old idea. But Kim refused to change in the way that so far Trump has refused to change. And foreign currency earnings became kind of Kim Il-sung's bond market in the way that, Trump has had to respond to the bond market. Kim really had to respond to an end of foreign currency earnings. And then, of course, heading towards the collapse of the Soviet Union and any subsidies coming from there, which was big for him, but refused to change. So what happened? You stuck to this policy and you just got stagnation. You just didn't shift. So in the 90s, the DPRK hit absolute rock bottom once even the Soviet Union wasn't there to prop them up anymore. And we saw decline, stagnation, famine as well, of course, awfully, but withdrawal from everything, right? Withdrawal from contact with anyone. And then when things got so bad after, that demographic black hole at the end of the famine in the 90s, there was this 2002 economic reform program, which I happened to be in Pyongyang when that happened. No one was expecting it. No one quite knew what had happened. It was a complete disaster.
Are you talking about the opening of the sort of informal markets? Or?
There was the opening of informal markets. There was the idea that Sinhuiju, which is up on the border near Dandong, the border with Jilin, would become a special economic zone, right? In the way that the Chinese had been very successful with Shenzhen and Zhuhai and so on. But there wasn't the legal framework to back it up. They didn't bother to even put in any of the infrastructure. So, yes, you might want to go and open a factory in Shenzhen, but you've got drains and power and, all those things. You didn't have any of that in North Korea. So it wasn't really worth doing. And there was also the overnight switch from the US dollar to the euro, which meant that, everybody's mattresses that were stuffed with dollars for the rainy day kind of suddenly became worthless overnight. And there was the informal markets, but there was a flip-flop on those markets and has continued to be a flip-flop on those markets ever since. So no one ever really commits much to them because you never know when someone's going to come along and shut you down. You don't know when someone's going to say you can do this and when someone says you can't. So I think that there's that kind of notion that you somehow can have this one big economic idea that solves everything. And Kim Il-sung thought, and then Kim Jong-il thought that this was Stalinism, and Trump thinks this is tariffs. And I think that this idea of being wedded to this one big idea, and this is very important in terms of China, because, of course, how did China get out of the mess of Maoism and the end of the Cultural Revolution? It was when Deng Xiaoping eventually said, 80% good, 20% bad. And so you suddenly had that. This is not a dear leader. This is not an infallible 100% right leader. We've got 20% of wiggle room here. So yes, of course, we're still keeping to socialism. Yes, of course, we're still the proletarian party of the masses, the Leninist party state. We will keep control. In those days, we used to talk about there'll be lots of perestroika, but no glasnost.
Right.
But you get that wiggle room of 20%, which allowed Deng Xiaoping, and through his kind of politicking at the time, and, well, of course, the energy and entrepreneurialism of the Chinese people, but then reinforced by Deng's southern tours and so on.
Right. And then once the country was rich enough, there's more space politically to continue operating a market economy, I suppose.
Now, Kim Il-sung took another route, and Kim Jong-il then took another route. And at the time, when the Chinese around Deng said to North Korea, why don't you attempt a similar sort of thing? Look what happened to the Soviet Union, and look what's happening to us. We're still solidly in control. Well, that did get a little wobbly at Tiananmen Square, but we're still basically in control. But we've also managed to start making money and lifting people out of poverty. And we can all argue about how successful that was. But, something definitely happened there that was better than Maoism. And, what was their reply? Well, it was one of these, if you open the window, flies get in, right? So we're not changing. We're not moving from that. And I feel that that approach by Kim Il-sung and then Kim Jong-il, that, you just can't deviate from something once you've said it, is what we see with Donald Trump. He doesn't want to shift from tariffs, and I don't know what can shift him from that policy. In Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il's case, empty shelves was not enough to shift them on policy. A famine was not enough to shift them on policy, and God forbid that should happen anywhere else. When a advanced consumer society starts seeing shortages of toilet paper and pasta and other things, as we know from Brexit and COVID and other things, people start to panic a little bit.
Yeah. It's very possible. Earlier this year, there was an egg shortage in much of the United States. My local supermarket just didn't have eggs for a few weeks. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if the shelves are suddenly empty and people might start panic buying toilet paper again.
Yeah. But we already had a couple of weird sort of things happen there, which were very North Korean to me. And I mean, I'm not talking about that bizarre cabinet meeting where they went round the table and everyone had to give a bit of praise
for the dear leader
to Donald Trump.
Right.
That was pure North Korean, right? And of course, whoever it is has started wearing these pin badges on their lapels, right? Which is kind of a strange one as well. Those are very outward things. But I think he's got a very strange name. What's his name? Rollin? Brooke Rollin. It's a very American name. Who's the agriculture secretary. I mean, what was his response to the egg crisis, right? It was buy some chickens and raise eggs in your backyard, which is not very useful when you're on the 16th floor of a tower block.
Right. But it's kind of like a future philosophy of self-reliance, right?
Well, almost, right? That you kind of feel that they could very easily go down this road, right? But both in terms of the theatrics of government, but also in the practicalities of government. This idea that the North Koreans have always wanted to have self-sufficiency, right? I mean, this is the essence of Juche theory, is to be self-sufficient. And yet, of course, they're one of the least self-sufficient places imaginable. They've been surviving on the drip feed of aid from the World Food Programme and various other countries and China and the South Koreans, of course, for such a long time now. So, but they always have this idea that you somehow just build factories or you just create these things in the way that Trump does. And it's just not possible to do. Where are you going to get the investment from? Where do you get the skills from? Where do you kind of do it? How do you do this? And I kind of feel like America is almost getting itself into a sort of a similar problem at the moment. When you look online and people say, well, look at the tariff I've got to pay on these goods, I won't be able to stay in business. People say, well, get it in America or make it in America. And you're just like, that level of idea that you can be self-sufficient, even in a continental economy like the United States now, is kind of impossible to think of. Of course, it's impossible in North Korea. with very limited natural resources, reliant on everything, really, just a bit of coal and not much else. So I kind of find that interesting. To me, there are a lot of things that I look at and I think, like, for instance, when they talk about, to start logging more, this is one that always sort of gets me going, because when they say, oh, well, we're going to start, logging the national parks and things like that. Korea, if you look at the famine and you look at the disasters that have happened in North Korea since, that have led to extreme food insecurity, logging has been a real major part of that. Because if you start cutting down all your trees, shipping them across the border to China, where they become lovely flooring for all these new apartments in Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou and elsewhere, Chongqing, and you don't replant the trees, the next time the rains come, everything just runs straight off and floods your fields at the bottom of the hill, right?
Right.
And so you lose it. So it perpetuates the problem. And you get into a cycle where you haven't got any meat because you haven't raised any livestock, and you haven't got any livestock because you had to eat it. And then you end up eating the seed, and eventually you're just left with sort of nothing. And that's how the North definitely slipped into famine, which I'm not saying America is about slipping into famine, but I think that idea of self-reliance and the idea that you somehow don't need things from outside, that somehow you can do everything yourself and you can turn it around and do it in 5 minutes flat, is kind of an idea that's been proved again and again to just not work in North Korea.
Yeah, it's magical thinking, I suppose, is the word people use for that now. Paul, when were you last in North Korea?
Oh, I haven't been there for a long time now. I've only been able to get to the border. I mean, the problem with writing a book about North Korea is that's kind of the end of...
going to North Korea.
The end of going to North Korea. So you're reliant on the project I just did with the BBC is about, not a lot of people know this, but outside of South Korea, the UK is the second largest legal home for North Koreans in terms of passports that have been handed out. I mean, obviously there's lots and lots of North Koreans in China, but they're there illegally.
Right. And then they're not going to be willing to be interviewed.
No. Here in the UK, we have 2,000 or 3,000 North Koreans who have either the citizens or are on the, what we term the pathway to citizenship here. Many of those made the decision to leave towards the end of the famine when things became really unbearable. Others came as children, and many of them took quite a long time to get here, having spent years in China trying to work out how to get out of China. Many of them then went to South Korea. Many of them decided to move on from South Korea for all sorts of interesting reasons. So I wanted to go out and speak to some of them about their decisions to go and what the routes that they took to end up in the UK, and really kind of how life has treated them since, how they've found the communities here welcoming or not welcoming, how easy it was to adjust and adapt. And that's kind of juxtaposed with the story of Tae Yong-ho, who was the deputy ambassador at the North Korean embassy in London, who in 2016 managed to get all his family to London, and they defected to South Korea.
Right.
He's now the MP for Gangnam, which is quite a cool place to be the MP for, I think.
Which is the trend from the song, Gangnam Style, right?
Yeah. And I mean, if you want to understand how, of course, he is like under 24-hour security. He's called everything imaginable, a paedophile, a maggot, God knows what by the North Koreans, because they're very imaginative in their insults. And this is how bad the situation is between North and South Korea, I think, which is he has been made the Minister for Unification, which just shows, because Kim Jong-un has ruled out unification. That once shibboleth has now gone. And the North and the South are not talking about that at all. And so they've put someone who is one of the most living, high-profile defector from North Korea as the Minister of Unification, which is kind of sort of, appointment to make.
A statement.
Yeah, it's very much a statement. So that shows you how kind of bad things have got there in terms of the relationship at the moment.
Yeah, it is interesting. I've only been once to North Korea. It was in 2007. I think it was a sunnier time than now, probably.
Yeah, I think, obviously the South is now actively working with Ukraine. I think everyone who's analyzing this is trying to work out what's happening with North Korean soldiers that are in the Ukraine or in Russia. But of course, this is an old situation that one of the things the North has always done since Kim Il-sung's time is kind of effectively trade workers particularly to the Russian Far East, also occasionally to China, and also to former Eastern Bloc. We've seen them pop up in former Czechoslovakia and Poland and elsewhere in the Eastern Bloc as kind of workers sent there. Lumber mills in the Russian Far East, factories in various other places.
It's essentially the government renting out people.
Yeah, renting out people. And if you go back to what could have been a slight break in things when it was Kim Dae-jung's sunshine policy from the South, and we created the Kaesong industrial zone, where the idea was that South Korean chaebols, South Korean, companies would invest. What did the North do? Well, it let workers go in, and then they came out and they sort of took the salary and then returned some of the salary to them. So again, it was sort of renting workers out. It wasn't what we'd seen in southern China previously, kind of was the blueprint that everybody wanted.
Right. It's just they couldn't give up control.
Yeah. So this kind of things I find interesting. I mean, the one thing I would like to say is I find the relationship between Trumpism and kind of mysticism and religion. Of course, I think that those are two sides of the same coin. But, to be very interesting in relation to thinking about North Korea. The legend that is built, Kim Il-sung's legend of a fairly standard guerrilla fighter. There were a lot of them, who was with the Russians against the then Japanese-controlled Korea, but he is sort of blown up to be this incredible military commander in terms of legend, as you can see it. Seems to me to rhyme quite well with the idea that Donald Trump is this superb businessman, which obviously doesn't quite stack up when you look at things, which I sort of find interesting.
And I mean, not only a superb businessman, that there is a sort of a strain of Trumpism here that sees him as somehow sent by God to, cure the woke.
Well, sent by God is a good one, but this idea of these people as superhuman, as if there are no other guerrillas fighting the Japanese, or as if there were no other property developers building anything in Manhattan. But I think that's part kind of good luck, but it's it's good luck for Kim Il-sung that he survived the war. But then there's this enormous engineering by the Soviets who decided that he was the guy they were going to back, in the way that Republicans have decided to sort of get behind Donald Trump and just sort of not really think about what the real story is, but just kind of buy into this idea. And then a lot of work on what you can only really describe as building a cult of personality. And we always talked about building a cult of personality, obviously with Mao, with other people, but really the most serious kind of structured building of a cult of personality, apart from Mao and Stalin, has been in North Korea. And that has been going alongside a constant and non-stop process of purging. So there always has to be purging. You always have to keep people on their toes. So I kind of think in one sense, though, that Kim Il-sung, the Soviets were kind of right in a sense that he was the man for the moment. He becomes a nation builder. Whether he's a good nation builder or a bad nation builder, but like people like Sukarno in the former Dutch East Indies, then Indonesia, similar characters, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, like others, he becomes a nation builder. It's just that, he builds a slightly odd nation. He is the man for the moment, but I wonder if ultimately Donald Trump is the man for the moment. Obviously, his followers think he is.
Yeah, they do.
But, the man for the moment, he can be the man for the moment. He can be a man of destiny. But he can also be bad. Stalin is a great example of that. But, you can also be like Mao, I think, or Churchill now. We can see the pros and the cons of decisions that were made. There's a Churchill in the bunker in World War II, but there's a Churchill who is obsessed with retaining India and the empire, and a white supremacist kind of Churchill. And of course, that'll get me lots of emails. But that kind of, there is a discussion to be had around someone like Churchill. And I think too with Mao. But Kim Il-sung, this idea of man of destiny, man of the moment, and a cult being built around that, whether it's, when Kim Jong-il was born, there was a very structured campaign in the North that, to say that glaciers cracked at Mount Pektu and these things happened. And it wasn't necessarily that people necessarily really believed that, these were signs from above as such, although running through the whole of the earlier North Korean Juche theory were ideas of evangelical Christianity, which was Kim Il-sung's own family background, and ideas of sort of traditional Korean beliefs and bits of Confucianism and so on, all sort of bolted together. But, the sort of cult of Trump's ear is a sort of interesting one. I'm not sure how many people, this is what worries me slightly, I suppose. I'm not sure how many people in North Korea really believe glaciers crack and herons fly and all the rest of it. But they understand the symbolism of this thing, right?
Yeah.
Trump's ear is symbolism, but I wonder how many people are believing it literally, that, God saved him.
I think there are a non-trivial number of people who believe that he's on some kind of divine mission. One has a different impression. I live in Tennessee. It's the buckle of the Bible Belt. So I meet people. That's not a very rare view amongst Trumpy types in the South. Paul, I don't know if you heard last Rhyming Chaos podcast I did. I interviewed Anthony Kuhn, who's the
course. Yeah.
National Public Radio correspondent in Seoul, South Korea. And he mentioned that there have been reports, allegations, nothing conclusive yet as far as I know, that former President Yoon had instructed military commanders to conduct a military strike against North Korea to trigger a North Korean backlash, which could then be used as a pretext for martial law. It's still being investigated, Anthony said. It didn't become part of the impeachment trial. But Anthony pointed out it upends everything we know about North Korea being the one that conducts provocations. What do you make of that?
What I make of that is that the South Koreans are always putting out lots of stories all the time. They're always saying lots of things. I mean, when you track back lots of stories that grab the headlines in tabloid newspapers, that there are only 3 permissible haircuts for men, or women are not allowed to ride bicycles or wear trousers, or other ones that have come out over the years, and rumors about the health of leaders and the sort of way that they live their life. A lot of this comes back to the South. There's a constant war going on of information and misinformation that's being circulated around. But I kind of never discount any of it, but I also never sort of believe any of it immediately. And the tabloid papers pick up on it because it's another nutsy North Korea story, and everybody kind of likes that, right?
Yeah.
So no, I mean, I don't know. I think that South Korea, of all the countries around the world faced with sort of Donald Trump and tariffs and a relationship with America that now needs to be thought, the Koreans are really one of the nations that has the most thinking to do, in a sense, because there's a lot of American soldiers in South Korea. I mean, I'm not sure what the number is right now, but I think including dependents and contractors, it's over 30,000. The offshore exercises that take place are enormous. America is obviously a massive market for South Korean companies, car companies, electronics. It's also a massive market for its soft power, its cultural power now, K-pop, movies, TV shows, all the rest of it. And I think, South Korea always had that relationship with America and built many of its foundations based on that relationship. And how it worked with or not with Japan, how it worked with or not with China was very much predicated on that relationship with America. And that relationship now is in the toilet, right? So of all the fundamental realignments, I don't think anyone's going to be particularly surprised that the Europeans are all going to get together over a nice lunch and make a decision to do something or nothing or somewhere in between. I mean, that's kind of what Europe does. I think the idea that South Korea is going to be reaching out much more to Tokyo, much more to Beijing, and much more to other places in the region is kind of a much more fascinating idea. And the North throwing soldiers into Ukraine just kind of adds a little extra spice to that kind of cocktail.
Yeah, very much so.
The one rhyming that I take from that is look at the sudden change of policy in 2002, economic policy, which is sort of comparative to the tariffs decision that Trump made. That no one was expecting tariffs on everybody, and the sort of bizarre calculation that was made and the escalation with China. And that seems to me to rhyme with what the North Koreans did and Kim Jong-il did in 2002. The only thing I take from that is that it was rolled back very, very quickly because it hurt people's savings. It led to a shortage of food and other products very, very quickly. And so all of that was junked to go back to more like the status quo, which is not great in North Korea. But, the status quo in America, though it wasn't working for everybody, was kind of generally working, I think. The deal, of course, was that at the end of that process, the rollback of all of those decisions, everybody was blamed for it except Kim Jong-il.
Right.
Everybody else had to take the blame. And by taking the blame in North Korea, that meant a few people had to literally fall on their sword. Other people got sent out, from Pyongyang to go and live in remote parts of the country. Other people's careers were over. And of course, nobody could say that, these ideas were Kim Jong-il's, and no one else could have pushed the go button on all of this except him. So the idea that you're the supreme leader, so therefore if things go wrong, you have to take all the blame, isn't true. Right? You're the supreme leader. You can press the go button. And when you press the stop button, you just blame everybody else and you sail on. And as long as you've got enough, of everyone in awe of you or everyone terrified of you, you can ride it through and stay in power. And North Korea is, if nothing else, an enormous, massive lesson in regime survival against the odds.
Right. I mean, we might be approaching a similar moment here with the tariffs. According to my understanding, in about a week and a half, the number of ships arriving at LA ports and other big ports in the United States is going to drop to very, very low numbers. And there are going to be shortages of stuff and everybody's going to have to pay more. for a lot of stuff. And the stock market is, a lot of people are very depressed about the stock market and their 401ks, their retirement packages. So I think it's quite conceivable that we have a moment where our dear leader changes his mind and then blames, I don't know, Peter Navarro or somebody for it.
Yeah, I mean, that idea that, he can just kind of create this massive amount of chaos, this devastation for lots of companies, for lots of individuals, for states, for the nation, and then just walk away from it. And of course, the one thing we haven't talked about is one thing Trump seems to be quite obsessed with is, and of course, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un are obsessed with his succession, and he's muted this idea of a third term, or, people are putting these things around that say, it'll go to Don Jr., then to Baron. They will become a kind of monarchy in the sense that we talk of the 3 generations of the Kim communist monarchy.
Yeah.
So succession is, normally you don't really, in a system like America, the UK or France or somewhere, you don't think so much in terms of succession. You do your 2 terms and you're out. Or, in the UK, you hang on as long as you can, and then eventually, usually your party stabs you in the back and gets rid of you for someone else. But we've now got someone who's talking, who really seriously is obsessed with succession.
Yeah. And I think, as we've all learned, you actually have to take him seriously when he says things, because he often means them. Doesn't always, but he often does.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing is, if you're obsessed with succession and you're obsessed with legacy in that way, you make decisions in certain ways. And so, this idea that, you're not necessarily making the decision that's good for the country, you're making the decision that's good for the succession, which is something we look at in North Korea all the time. What ensures regime survival, not what gets North Korea out of this economic hole that it's in, which would improve everybody's life.
Yeah, that would make sense. The Trump clan, it's interesting that the children have been far less visible this time than they were in the first administration. You don't see much of them on TV.
Well, that's good.
Well, I don't know. I think it means they're in the back room looting the country.
Okay.
They just realized publicity is no good. On that note, Paul, thank you so much. The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Jeremy Goldkorn, and edited by Cadre Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Erik Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, leave us a review, and if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com. Thank you so much, Paul. It was a pleasure to talk to you again.
Cheers.